freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
All right, welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am, as always, your host, Nico Perrino, and I'm here today with the distinguished Ron Collins. He's a First Amendment scholar, and he's the author of many books, but the topic of our conversation today is The People versus Ferlinghetti, the fight to publish Allen Ginsberg's Howl. It is co-authored with David Skover. Ron, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Were you always a fan of the Beatniks?
No, they were a little before my time. They're pretty late 40s, early 50s. And so along with Lenny Bruce, they were about 10 years or so before my time. I'd heard of them, but I can't say, I grew up with the Bob Dylan generation, like a Rolling Stone, what have you. So no, these fellows were all before my time.
I always kind of had a hard time understanding the Beatniks, and it seems to me that mostly stems from the fact that I don't really have a strong connection to the era in which they were writing. Like I reread Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which is kind of the central poem of this book, and it just seems like so much of it is New York circa 1950. And I mean, let's start with talking about Howl.
Okay, so a lot of folks think that the counterculture begins with Bob Dylan and, that generation in the 60s. It really begins in the 50s, all right, when societal norms are called into question, societal norms having to do with capitalism, having to do with equality, having to do with homosexuality, having to do with obscenity. It's really the Beats that step on the stage, the cultural stage, and for the first time, at least in contemporary history, or more modern history, I should put it, challenge those conventional norms. So before there was Bob Dylan, there was Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and that whole generation of folks. And poetry and literature were their main venues. Of course, the whole idea of beat music also comes into play. Kind of riffs on various types of jazz music and what have you. But like I said, before there was Once Upon a Time, I Dressed So Fine, I Threw a bum a dime in my prime, before Bob Dylan said those incredible words or something to that effect in Like a Rolling Stone. There was Allen Ginsberg and the opening lines of Howl, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness.
What prompted Allen Ginsberg to write Howl? And actually, it's referred to as Howl now, but its original title was Howl for Carl Solomon.
Yeah, in an earlier book with David Skover, a long book, about 500 pages, called Mania. And Mania is basically the story of the Howl poem. And the Howl poem is really autobiographical. I mean, it took us about 500 pages to kind of put the whole story together. It's an incredible poem, and it really begins with a car chase in the early 50s when Allen Ginsberg is kind of with some criminal types, people who rob banks and trade in heroin. And in any event, he got to know them because they were kind of countercultural types, as it were. And it turns out that one time they had to move some heist, and they were going to move. Allen wasn't responsible for any of the thefts, but he went along with them for a car ride when they were moving some of the materials, some of the goods that they had stolen from one place to another, because the police were hot on their tail. And the car turns the wrong way down the one-way street. And, of course, at the end of the one-way street is a police car, and the police car chases them. And it's a high-speed chase. It ends in a car crash. Allen Ginsberg is caught. He has to plead a defense. And thanks to some professors at Columbia University, where he was then attending, they cop a deal. And the deal is that instead of going to jail, he'll go to an asylum. A mental asylum.
How old is he at this point?
Early 20s. And it is there in the asylum that he meets Carl Solomon, who really was had a maniac quality about him, and they strike up a friendship. And then while Allen Ginsberg is there, the psychologists and psychiatrists discover that he's gay, and of course they see that as a psychological illness. So he is quote unquote treated for that illness, and then he's released, but on a condition. There was a lot of bad influence, they thought, for him to continue to live in New York, so he had to go someplace safe, and they recommend San Francisco.
And it's there he meets Lawrence Ferlinghetti.
He first comes there. He's going to go straight. Has a job at an advertising agency. He's dated a woman. He tells Jack Kerouac, "This is really good. I'm into it." And then one day he walks into a gallery. He sees the painting of a young man in the nude who's gay. One thing leads to another. He falls in love, breaks up with the woman, leaves the ad agency, walks into this brand new bookstore that's opened called City Lights. Lawrence Ferlinghetti was then the co-owner, soon became the sole owner. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was that time the owner of the bookstore, had just launched a pocketbook poet series. And Allen Ginsberg, the two of them get to know each other. Allen Ginsberg proposes a collection of poems, and Ferlinghetti takes a pass. But that wasn't the end of the story.
No, it wasn't. Allen Ginsberg was pretty down and out at this point. I read in your book that he was kind of at his last straws. He had like $30 in his bank account.
You're right. No, I mean, the sanity didn't last too long. Allen Ginsberg, this kind, gentle, but he was a maverick. I mean, he was an outsider. I don't think he ever felt comfortable standing in line, in conventional line with anybody. But he strikes up a friendship with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who's a kindred spirit, but in many respects a very, very different person. Unlike a lot of the Beats, who were uninhibited and at times almost suicidal. I mean, some of them were involved in antics that took their life, and some of that is recorded in Howl. Did drugs and a lot of very unconventional things, and also illegal things. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, PhD from the Sorbonne, businessman. Yes, he's radical. Yes, he has his socialist and anarchist credentials. But he's not a crazy man. I mean, he's not going to get plastered on alcohol and stick his head out a subway car at a high speed and be decapitated, as happened to one of Allen's friends. So he was, although he hung with the Beats and he very much supported them and supported their literature, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who had also served in the military during the Second World War, was a very different sort of man. Was he a maverick? Absolutely. In fact, that's the first word of our
American
book.
Maverick.
Yeah.
Why would he commission a poem from Allen Ginsberg? Was Allen Ginsberg known at that time? Allen Ginsberg was 29 years old, down and out, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, to kind of launch pocketbooks, more or less, right?
Yeah, he launched it more, no less, just more.
Why would Allen Ginsberg be that person?
Well, remember the first set of poems that Allen pitched to him, he took a pass on. I mean, Lawrence Ferlinghetti was, among other things, a businessman, and I say that in a very respectful sense. He wasn't going to. I mean, yes, the poems had to be radical. Yes, they had to have cultural commentary. Okay, but they also had to be good, at least as he saw them. And so he had started. Allen Ginsberg had come to him and said, "I have this other poem, Howl," and he'd been working on it. He hadn't completed it, and Ferlinghetti told him, "I'm very interested in this. Keep me posted on it." And indeed, Allen did keep him posted on it, and it was the beginning of a friendship and beginning of an arrangement between the two gentlemen, which would end, as did almost all of the contracts in those days with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, in nothing more than a handshake.
Let us talk about Howl for Carl Solomon. Tell me about that poem. What's in it? What's the message of it?
What's not in it?
Yeah, I know. It's long and it can seem kind of like stream of conscious to a lay reader.
Yeah, so let me just tell you a little bit before how it comes into being.
Well, he met Carl Solomon.
Yeah, he met Carl Solomon, but it's autobiographical. I mean, if you just hear a particular line on its face or read a particular line on its face, it may not make much sense to you, you know. You have to kind of know the backstory to get some feel for what was involved in this poem, which you said was originally the title was, Howl for Carl Solomon, and then Ferlinghetti had suggested that it just be Howl. And then on the title page that had the dedication.
Was Carl Solomon anyone of note, or was he just some guy you met in the asylum?
he was a pretty crazy guy.
Yeah.
Would throw potato salad, as an art form and what have you. Would end up himself writing a book or two. To be honest with you, nothing of any great moment. But there was something about Carl Solomon's madness, something about this uninhibited side of him, something about him being a code breaker that very much appealed to Allen Ginsberg.
So we were going to get into the backstory of the poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what is the message of the poem?
There's many messages. For one of the things that's very important in the poem. We all think that Stonewall is the kind of the birth of the gay rights movement. Not to take any credit away from it. Obviously, it was a very significant moment. But Howl, among other things, and I have to say, among other things, is basically Allen Ginsberg in 1956 and 1957 outing himself in a blatant way as a homosexual man. I mean, this just had never been done. I mean, as a practical matter, in 1956, gay people didn't exist. And I say didn't exist in the sense that they were closeted, right? You went into bars where you had to knock on the door to get in, and you had to know a certain password and what have you. So for somebody to openly out themselves in a poem, this was just unheard of. It's also, in many respects, a critique of capitalism, a very strident critique of capitalism. It's also a story about the lives that intersected with Allen Ginsberg's, some for better, some for worse, some for glory, some for tragedy. It's all there in one, and it's also very much about his mother and his relationship with his mother. And his mother was also mad, and I mean, literally had some very serious mental disorders. So all of that finds its way into Howl, and that's why the opening lines, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness," he did. I mean,
So he has this refrain in the poem, "Who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who poverty and tatters and fantastic minds sat up all night in lofts contemplating jazz, who sat in rooms naked and unshaving listening to the terror through the wall, who demanded sanity, trials, accusing the radio man of hypnotism and were left with their insanity and their hands and hung a journey, who cut out each other's hearts on the banks of the Hudson, life's a drama on a great lost stage under the crimson streetlight of the moon." And then this is where we get to the homosexual part, "who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy, who were blown by the human angels, the sailors, the caresses of Atlantic and Caribbean love."
We can't do justice to Allen Ginsberg. The reason why I was saying go and pounding is because at Six Gallery was a carriage shop. By that, I meant at the turn of the century where you brought your carriage and horse to have your carriage repaired. It hadn't changed much by 1956. There was still dirt on the floors. But this is where Howl is read for the first time. Allen Ginsberg comes out in a sport coat and a tie. He's one of the later readers. All these poets have gotten together. Jack Kerouac is there passing around a jug of cheap red wine. And while Allen Ginsberg is reciting the poem, and with each of the refrains, who this, who that, who this, they're pounding their feet on the floor, and Ginsberg and others are going, go, 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 go. And the momentum is just incredible.
I mean, is he kind of like screaming this poem?
Yes. And it's
in a rage almost.
Yes. And it's just, and of course, one of the people sitting in the back rather calmly, but taking it all in, is none other than Lawrence Ferlinghetti.
the publisher of this work.
Yeah, and it's this magical moment. It's this pinpoint in time that changes things. Now, it needed a little bit more to make it onto the national scene. But at this moment in time, in fact, Kenneth Rexroth, a noted literary figure from the time, came up to Allen Ginsberg afterwards and said something to the effect that, this is going to change your life and change our generation, something to that effect. It was just an incredible moment. I mean, a lot of people had read poems that night, but nobody was in the same universe with Allen Ginsberg. And so that night, Jack Kerouac and his buddies go off to one of the local hangouts to celebrate and get bombed. But one person doesn't. Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He leaves, he goes home, and he dictates a telegram to Allen Ginsberg, echoing the words of Emerson in a letter to Walt Whitman, and then closed with the words, "When do I get the manuscript?" And thus begins. And then it's just a handshake. That's all.
Yeah, that telegram is lost to history, though, right?
Forgive me for saying, if anybody at City Lights is hearing this, that purported telegram, yes. Yeah.
I just want to read a few more lines of the poem to give people a sense of what it was, and we want them to think back to that reading. What was the name of the place?
Sixth Gallery.
Sixth Gallery. And just imagine Allen Ginsberg kind of in a rage, possessed.
Yes, and all of the crowd stamping their feet, going, "Go, go, go, go," and passing the jug of wine, cheap Thunderbird wine, what have you, or Gallo, I'm not sure, one of those.
So the poem passage of it, who burned cigarette holes in their arms protesting their narcotic tobacco blaze of capitalism, who passed out super communist leaflets in Union Square weeping and undressing while the sirens of Los Alamos wailed them down, who screamed on all fours in the subway and who were dragged off the roof waving genitals and manuscripts, who journeyed to Denver, who died in Denver, who came back and waited in Denver, watched and went away finally to find out the future, who fell on their knees in hopeless cathedrals praying for each other's salvations. Ah, Carl, while you're not safe, I am not safe, and now you're in the total soup of time. I'm jumping around a little bit there, but you can kind of get the sense, the refrain.
What would life be without poetry? I mean, really. This is the sort of thing that it may not speak to the mind, but it definitely speaks to the heart. And that's what was happening. That was part of that magical moment that night in Sixth Gallery. And you couldn't be there and be unaware that something transformative had just happened. The other thing is that I'm glad you read it because, by the way, there's a 1959 recording of Howl. It might even be on YouTube. It's really quite moving. Not the same as the Sixth Gallery one, but quite moving nonetheless.
Does Ginsberg read it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We'll try and cut some in here and make a note of that.
Yeah, I'll show you. But the poem, it's one thing to read it. It's another thing to hear it. Because when you hear it, the ethos, the passion, the soul of the poem comes out in a way that the retina cannot capture just as it's, browsing across each stanza.
On page 42 of your book, you go over some of the themes that are in the poem that might lead to outrage or even censorship. You talk about how it's pro-communist, how it's pro-homosexuality, pro-promiscuity, anti-capitalist, and anti-American. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti kind of predicted that something might happen once he published this book. Right. And so he calls the local ACLU.
Well, right? Of course, it also had some pretty colorful language in it, too, right? Some of which you've already read.
Ass,
Yeah, right. Yes, it was, it may well have been anti-American for Ginsberg. I don't know. I don't think it would have been anti-American for Ferlinghetti. Ferlinghetti, it would have been Whitman-esque America, all right? I mean, remember, this man had served proudly in the Second World War. I mean, yes, he was a socialist. Yes, he had this counterculture way about him. But I think the America of Walt Whitman would have been very much his America. So in that sense, I don't think it would have been anti-American. But in any event, yes. So Ferlinghetti, he's a very savvy guy, And by the way, he's cool, he's calm, not no drama queen like these others. So he decides, he realizes ahead of time that he's going to need some outside help to pull this off. That is to publish Howl and other poems as one of the Pocket Poet series. They were just a matter of 50 cents or something like that. And they're called Pocket Poets because you could put it in your back pocket. I mean, literally, you could and carry around poetry. By the way, City Lights was the first all paperback bookstore. That didn't exist prior to that. So he contacts the local ACLU, Lawrence Spicer, there at that office. Spicer, by the way, was a seasoned constitutional lawyer, the Northern California chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. Spicer had his own case, a loyalty case, the same time at the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, he had his own case involving himself, a loyalty oath case, which he prevailed in. And then there was another young man named Al Bendick, had just a few months out of law school, out of Bolt. And the ACLU says, look, if you have any troubles, we'll represent you. Ferlinghetti decides to have the book published abroad in England.
Why?
It's cheaper.
Yeah.
Much cheaper. But the publisher had run into some problems a year before, publishing a magazine called Miscellaneous Man, probably a homosexual magazine, and it had been seized by customs for being obscene. So the publisher said, look, we don't want to get busted again or, have everything seized by customs. So the colorful words that were replaced with asterisks. Okay. So then the books are en route to the United States, and customs officials see the name of the publisher, the printer, and they think, oh my God, this is the same guy that did Miscellaneous Man. And they seize all the copies of Howl, but they don't even open the boxes. They just seize them. Because it's the same printer. Yeah. And so essentially what you had was obscenity by implication, And so when it went to the United States attorney said, look, we can't bust somebody, we can't seize goods just for asterisks. So it comes to the United States. Then Ferlinghetti decides that he's going to have a printer in the United States print it, this time with the colorful words, which meant that the customs officials couldn't seize it. And it seems like all's well and fine until a local prosecutor with a lot of time on his hands gets wind of this book.
And the authorities come to City Lights and confiscate the books, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti isn't in the store at the time, I don't believe.
Well, you just had this is a sting operation. This is undercover. They have plain clothes men. They come out, they kind of case the place, and they can come in looking hip and beat and what have you. And they get a couple of things and a copy of Howl, and they go back, and then they get an arrest warrant, and they come back and seize it. And the clerk is arrested. Ferlinghetti is not there at the time. Now, think about the clerk being arrested. It's like, I didn't publish the poem. I didn't write the poem, right? I mean, I didn't even read the poem. And you're arresting me,
Yeah, well, his name is Shigeyoshi Murao. I might not be pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, also known as Shig.
Shig, yeah. And you talk in the book about how, I just kind of, he says he wanted to just live a quiet life,
right.
Listen to some music, read some books. His family had been interned during the war. And so, and it was also looked down in Japanese society to get arrested and be jailed. And so this would be a stain on his family. So he very much did not welcome this prosecution in a way that Lawrence Ferlinghetti said, being locked up in the can, I'll get some time to read some books.
That's poetry. Right.
Yeah.
Right. No. Ferlinghetti, cool, calm, kind of Cool Hand Luke, sort of thing. By the way, San Francisco in 1957 was a very different place. All of these beat types that were coming there were not welcome. They were persona non grata. They were seen as dirty, promiscuous, anti-American, what have you. So that whole environment in San Francisco where this beat, West Coast beats, the East Coast beats too, but the West Coast beat movement is starting here. They were not welcome. And so when this case went to trial, and this prosecutor was prosecuted for obscenity. By the way, in those days, words could be obscene. The distinction between obscenity and indecency didn't exist. So you could have something, just words in a book that were deemed obscene. And in 1956 and 1957, this just seemed like a slam dunk case, right? It was so simple that the prosecutor, when they prosecuted the case, their case was, well, here are the words, Your Honor, and then kind of res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. They didn't feel they had to put on much more of a defense than that. And by the way, the prosecutor, just to kind of indicate how filthy he thought all this was, introduced the evidence in a brown paper bag. Although there were no pictures or anything, so. And so the reason I mention what San Francisco was like, and David Skover and I stress this in the book, in 1956-57 was it had a lot to do with why the defense did not pick a jury. There was just no way you would want a jury from San Francisco to hear this case. So they it was the roll of the dice, and they decided to take their chances with a judge.
And take their chances they did. And I'm sure when they learned who that judge would be, they weren't too happy about it, because this judge is
Clayton Horn. Yeah.
Probably not recognizable to any of our listeners, but this is a Sunday school preacher who had previously sentenced someone to watch the Ten Commandments after shoplifting.
So you're cutting into my action here. So if you were...
And hold on, before we get there, let's explain to our listeners that you can choose to have a trial by jury, or you can choose to have the judge render the verdict.
Right. And it would have been very dangerous to have a trial. I mean, I suspect that if they had a trial by jury, they would have been convicted. I mean, that's why they took... I mean, it was risky having a judge, but it was super risky having a jury. So they decided that they would take a judge. And by the way, when you decide you're going to have a bench trial, as they call it, a judge trial, you don't know who the judge is, right? Because they're picked by lot. And so that when the lot came up, it came up Clayton Horn. Well, who's Clayton Horn? Well, a few months earlier, Clayton Horn had a few women, I think it might have been 4 women, appear before him for shoplifting. He very quickly found them guilty, and their sentence was to go watch the Ten Commandments, which was in the movie theaters then, and they had to go and write an essay about the Ten Commandments, and which, by the way, was a very violent movie that had, its sexual component to it, what have you. But in any event, they went, watched the movie, had to come back in court and recite the essay that they had written. This was their punishment. Horn had gotten a lot of flack in the local paper for this at the time. They ridiculed him. They, editorialized against him, which is another thing I think is important to mention. This fight for First Amendment of freedom involves a poet who's in Tangiers. Allen Ginsberg is nowhere. I mean, he's not around for any of this. So he writes the poem, but somebody else is taking the action. So involves a poet who's not there, a poem that's being prosecuted, a clerk that's being prosecuted, a publisher, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, is being prosecuted, and a bookstore owner, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who's being prosecuted. And part of that whole First Amendment mix of things was the San Francisco Chronicle. And the San Francisco Chronicle, from the outset, stood with Ferlinghetti on his First Amendment claims. In fact, early on, right after Ferlinghetti is arrested and charged, yes, he writes a piece in the local paper, basically telling the authorities he doesn't care. He's not going to stop selling the book. So if you just think about it, this meant they could have put him out of business and they could have put him in jail. I mean, and he said, "Bring it on." And he didn't just whisper it; he put it in the local paper. And he also saw that copies of Howl remained in the storefront window while the case was being tried. I mean, this is pretty ballsy, right? I mean, I like to tell people it's so easy to forget that if you believe in freedom, if you believe in the First Amendment, you have to understand there's an element of risk. Mm-hmm. if you're not willing to buy into the risk, then there's no freedom worth protecting.
Well, what did he risk here exactly? Jail time?
He risked seizing all of the books, making the publication of Howl impossible, and if he continued to do so, shutting down his bookstore.
Yeah, and how long did he stand to, what was the jail term for this? I mean,
this is a misdemeanor, but still several months,
Yeah.
But the thing is if he continued to sell, then they could seek an order prohibiting. I mean, the whole law of prior restraint and all of these other things didn't exist. And this would have been a slam dunk case, a very easy case to get a conviction in 1957, except for one thing that had happened earlier in 1957. A few months earlier, a new Supreme Court justice had just written a majority opinion in a case called Roth versus United States. That Supreme Court justice was William Brennan. It was an obscenity case. He ruled against the rights claimant, so he ruled against the First Amendment claim. But in doing so, he did something that was extremely important. He said there's a difference between obscenity on the one hand, which is not protected, and sexual expression on the other hand, which is protected. That distinction. So it wasn't enough, if you came with a book or a poem, it wasn't enough to say that there was something dirty in it. You had to show that it didn't have socially redeeming value. You had to show that it appealed to prurient interest, these sorts of things. So as the Howl case is coming to court, this dichotomy between obscenity unprotected and sexual expression protected hadn't been tested. This is one of the first cases in the United States to test it. And the judge who's charged with testing the case is Clayton Horn. And as we said, if you knew anything about Clayton Horn, why would a man who was a Sunday school preacher, right? Put aside, Roth versus United States, put aside, remember, he is a municipal judge. Municipal judges are at the bottom of the judicial ladder.
Dealing with fender benders, right. Petty crime.
Right, dog barking nuisances, you know, this sort of thing. By the way, they don't render constitutional opinions. They don't render opinions because if they did render a published opinion, there'd be no place to publish it, right? Municipal judges, their opinions, they can write them, but there's no place to publish them. Only appellate courts had them. So, if you were coming into the case, why would you think, even if you had Lawrence Spicer and the young Al Bendick defending you pro bono, there was one other lawyer, we'll get to him in a second, but why would you think that Clayton Horn, also think about Clayton Horn and the blowback that he would get from his congregants, from the people in his church. This couldn't have been well received by them.
Well, he couldn't win no matter which way it came out. He wasn't winning in the press because of that 10 Commandments sentence. And if he sided with Howell or with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the defense in this case, and he'd get blowback from his congregation. So let's talk a little bit about the trial. It commenced, I believe, on August 8th, 1957. And this trial lasts...
I'll take your word for that. That sounds right.
I think I put it down right. Double check by his book and then double check me.
I hope it's a reliable source.
Yeah, right? The trial lasts weeks.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Which I find just astounding.
Lenny Bruce's obscenity trial lasted months.
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll get there, too, because...
Yeah, right. Right.
Now, Horn was involved in that case. This guy didn't really know what he was getting into when he took the municipal job. But, all right, what do the defense need to prove? What does the defense need to prove in order to win this case? And how do they pursue it?
Well, they have to go off on sexual expression. They have to make a case that first and foremost, two things. It doesn't appeal to prurient interest. So is anybody going to get a sexual buzz on reading Howl? I don't think so. It may do many things, but, I don't think that's it. But they did have to establish that it had socially redeeming value. And this informs the witnesses they get, people with literary experience and what have you. And Lawrence Spicer takes the lead in that. Young Al Bendick is preparing. Al Bendick, again, I want to mention this name because he's a few months out of law school, but he plays a very significant role, and that is he blends the testimony of the expert witnesses, the several expert witnesses they had, with the law. And the law was emerging then. So point by point, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, argument by argument, he has to build the case. And that memorandum of points and authority that the young Al Bendick will write proves to be very, very important. So you have Al Bendick doing basically kind of the law work. You have Spicer doing some of the oral arguments, but also getting all the expert witnesses. This is going to be very important, all right? And then you have Jake Never Plead Guilty Ehrlich, and he's the show.
This is a colorful character.
Right, yeah. He's the showboat. He was a very high-end attorney that did high-end cases, represented a lot of movie stars involved in ugly divorce battles. He loved those. A lot of publicity, a lot of money, a lot of controversy. He represented, he was involved in the Chessman case, which is a very important death penalty case at the time. And he agreed to do this case pro bono. He wasn't a constitutional law expert. He wasn't a First Amendment expert.
That's really something, because this is a guy who, in your book you say he charged $1,000 a minute for oral argument in court. His justification was, well, if I get you off, then you'll be free. You'll have your liberty. It'll be worth it. If I don't get you off, then you'll be jail, and it won't matter how much money you have.
He had a special rate in death penalty cases. So his cufflinks literally in 1957 were $25,000 for a pair of cufflinks. He wore Italian tailored suits, high-end cowboy boots, and he knew how to turn a phrase in a courtroom. On death penalty cases, though, he had a special rate. So he usually charged $1,000 a minute, but in death penalty cases, it was everything you own. And his rationale, consistent with what you said, is if I win, it was worth it, and if I lose, it doesn't matter. So Jake Never Plead Guilty Ehrlich, or sometimes known as the Master. So that's the team: Jake Ehrlich, Spicer, and Al Bendick. And each of them performs a very important role.
Why did Ehrlich take this case pro bono?
We're not sure. By the way, he probably the publicity.
It was all over the papers.
Yeah.
And actually, the audience for the trial, is a who's of beatniks.
Yeah.
They're there supporting Lawrence Ferlinghetti.
Right. But who was there in I think a velvet green sport coat and tie. And by the way, there is a transcript, I have to put it in quotes, transcript of the Howell trial that was published by Jake Ehrlich afterwards. But it turns out in the transcript where Lawrence Spicer was conducting the oral arguments, in a few places Al Bendick, that's not in this transcript, but he did publish that afterwards. So yeah, I think it was largely for the publicity. But you put it all together, the thing is you still have Judge Howl. Mm-hmm.
Judge Horn.
Excuse me, Judge Howell.
Judge for Howell in this case.
Judge Horn. And so the case is presented. The courtrooms are packed with people, getting a lot of publicity. By the way, this is when the part of Howell's rise to national attention is the trial. The best thing that could ever happen to launch Howl, to kind of give a staying power to the Beat generation, was this trial. Okay, and this trial now is being recorded both locally and nationally. Mm-hmm. And so,
that's the case with most censorship. You try and censor it, and the thing that you're trying to censor gains greater prominence. And was it Lawrence Ferlinghetti or Allen Ginsberg? One of them kind of predicted this and kind
hoped
for the censorship.
Well, yeah, writing to Ferlinghetti from Tangiers, Allen Ginsberg thought, this could really be bad for Larry, but then again, it could be really good for me, in the poem. The other thing is Allen Ginsberg was a master when it came to public relations and publicity and what have you. It just happened that this particular gig was not one that he was involved in.
Well, he had probably seen cases of censorship with other beatniks, right? Because censorship was kind of common with the beatniks.
Well, at the time, there was another one of his friends, Jack Kerouac's Allen on the Road. It's an incredibly popular novel. It just come out. Naked Lunch is being edited, Bill Burroughs' book, which itself will be prosecuted for obscenity. But the case comes to Judge Howell. Some time goes by, and he issues a written opinion.
As you said, unheard of.
Typescript, and copies were, there was nothing to Xerox. Xerox didn't exist, or photocopy. So carbon copies. And this opinion comes out, and it is one of the great pieces of First Amendment literature. I mean, it's really, you would have never expected that this judge, not only did he vindicate the First Amendment claim, all right, that is, not only did he say to the government, you cannot prosecute this poem, you cannot prosecute this man, but he did so in ways that were far ahead of his time, far ahead of his time.
Again, we're looking at October of 1957.
Right,
here.
and he did it with a certain finesse and eloquence that is just hard to describe. And I'm happy to say that we had the honor of publishing that opinion in its entirety. There had been earlier versions of it, but not complete, in its entirety as an appendix to our book. And it's a remarkable opinion.
Well, let's read some of the opinion, because
Okay.
you, as you said, the entirety of it is published as an addendum, but you quote from it in the main text. So here's some of it. The authors of the First Amendment knew that novel and unconventional ideas might disturb the complacent, but they chose to encourage a freedom which they believed essential if a vigorous enlightenment was ever to triumph over slothful ignorance. The best method of censorship is by the people as self-guardians of public opinion, and not by government. He continues, life is not encased in one formula whereby everyone acts the same or conforms to a particular pattern. No two persons think alike. We are all made from the same mold, but in different patterns. Would there be any freedom of the press or speech if one must reduce his vocabulary to the vapid and innocuous euphemism? An author should be real in treating his subject and be allowed to express his thoughts and ideas in his own words. And it's with that Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Shig, as you said, get off.
Well, yeah, the case is dismissed against Shig. So, but the opinion really is for Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I mean, we tend to think, when we think of these incredible moments in First Amendment history, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Louis Brandeis, Hugo Lafayette Black, William O. Douglas, William Brennan, more contemporary, maybe Justice Anthony Kennedy or John Roberts. But in terms of the spirit of the First Amendment, it's hard to find many lines that can equal the ones that you've just read from Judge Clayton Horne.
And this wasn't a precedent-setting opinion. As you said, they don't issue opinions. And
it wasn't a precedent in a literal sense, but it was a precedent in a functional sense. And that is that after Judge Horne had released his opinion, first of all of a sudden Howl goes national, all right? National news, all right? It is the last poem that is ever criminally prosecuted and tried in court in the United States. It never will happen again. And although, remember, this opinion was not binding in the next city or county. So, I mean, if somebody had published Howl in Bakersfield, this opinion would have no precedential value. I mean, it's a municipal judge in San Francisco. Not only would it have no precedential value in any other city or county in San Francisco, it would have no precedential value in any other state. But it's amazing, after this opinion comes out, Howl is sold in Boston, Howl is sold in Chicago, Howl is sold in Alabama, Howl is sold in Nebraska. It's sold in all of these places, and yet nowhere is it. Something had changed. And the thing is that before Bob Dylan had said the times they are a-changin', in 1957, the times they were a-changin'. So at that point, you have Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, and you have Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road. And a whole new culture is now emerging among young people.
And there was backlash in the press, as we've said. Did that prevent it or provide protection to Howl from the censorship that we saw here
It will
in San
never.
Francisco?
Howl would never, as a printed matter, and I emphasize it's a printed matter because the story doesn't end because we have to come 50 years
we'll
later.
get there.
Yeah, but no, Howl is safe. Now, of course, other publications like William Burroughs' Naked Lunch and other publications will have to deal with censors. But the other thing is that Judge Clayton Horn gave staying power to Justice Brennan's Roth versus Young. I mean, really, Roth does not kind of come into its day until years later in Miller versus California.
Yeah, we don't think of Roth as being a good First Amendment opinion.
No.
It's an improvement in some sense.
Well, it was William Brennan being Machiavellian, rule against the rights claimant, but open up the First Amendment jar, if you will. And that dichotomy is extremely important. And so here you have it being, as far as we know, this is the first case to kind of put the Roth test to work. And if truth be known, they went beyond the Roth test. I would be amiss if I did not say, despite the eloquence and the soundness of, or notwithstanding the eloquence and soundness of Judge Horn's opinion, it was substantially influenced and made possible by the handiwork of Al Bendick, who was who would years later would have some pretty famous clients in San Francisco as well.
Clayton Horn, the municipal judge, again, is such a fascinating character. Do we have any insight into his mind in writing this opinion? And I ask that because Sunday school preacher, did he actually believe what he was saying about the First Amendment?
He took this very seriously. He spent an enormous amount of time.
He read Howl.
Yeah, he not only read Howl, he read Howl carefully.
I just can't imagine
read Supreme Court opinions. He went and read a lot of literature. He took this very seriously. It took him months. For whatever reason, was it I got a bad rap in the press and now I need something to kind of improve my record. Was it that? Maybe. Was it that, or he really believed this and this was really an eye-opening moment for him? All right. And if it was, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. You don't kind of write these. This wasn't a mechanical opinion.
Yeah,
right?
This is the language of a believer.
Yeah. And the thing is that what would have been typical in this case is to say, you come up to the bench and, you have the defendant stand and you say, guilty or not guilty. And you pound the gavel and that's it. That's how municipal judges hear scores of cases in one day. I mean, so what it would have been, I imagine too, I hadn't thought about this, Nico, before this, but my guess is his colleagues probably wouldn't have been too happy either, because this has taken a lot of time on the docket, which means their caseloads are going to be heavier because Horn's there, deciding this case. And really, Clayton, you're writing an opinion? What's that about? I mean, so this couldn't have been well received by his colleagues.
But he did, correct me if I'm wrong, he did oversee another First Amendment case later. I mean, we've talked in a previous podcast about the trials of Lenny Bruce, another book that you've written.
With David Skover.
With David Skover, yes, of course. We don't want to forget David, who's also appeared on this podcast with you to talk about robotica. But Lenny Bruce was brought up on obscenity charges in San Francisco, and Clayton Horn was on that case, too.
Well, he gets Al Bendick to represent him.
Lenny does.
Yeah, Lenny Bruce does. And Bruce, Bruce decides that he wants a jury trial, And
he wants to
by the way,
represent
Lenny Bruce had hung around also in City Lights bookstore. And so he knew about the beats. He knew Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And so he decides that he wants a jury trial. Bendick says, no, this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. We could easily get Judge Horn, and he's the guy you want. And Lenny says, no, I want a jury of my peers. All right, I want that people. And Bendick says, you're crazy. The people will rule against you, right? They didn't like the beats in 57, and they don't like your foul mouth now.
Yeah, your foul-mouthed comedy, for those of you who don't know Lenny Bruce, is a famous comedian in the 1960s.
Right. Also infamous comedian, right? So, but, he decides not to take his lawyer's advice. He has a jury trial, and the judge presiding over the case, Clayton Horn. As it turned out, but for Clayton Horn, Lenny Bruce would have been found guilty. The jury was polled afterwards. They found him not guilty, but they were polled afterwards, and they said they were ready to a person to convict him. The only reason they didn't, the sole reason, the main reason, was the fact that the jury instructions that Judge Horn had given them were so restrictive that given the facts of the case and the way that Al Bendick had argued the case, there was no way that they could get around finding anything except a not guilty. So had it not been for Clayton Horn, chances are excellent that Lawrence Ferlinghetti would have been convicted and Lenny Bruce would have been convicted as well.
And this is a case in which Al Bendick or Lenny Bruce had representation the whole time. This wasn't one of those cases where he threw out his lawyer.
No.
Which would come later.
Or decided to argue the case himself, which is really crazy. But, and then Clayton Horn just vanishes into obscurity. By the way, the way we first came across the Howl story was that when we were doing the Lenny Bruce book, we got to meet Al Bendick. And Al Bendick he saved everything. So
is he still alive?
No, he died several years ago.
There's a picture of you with him here in 2013.
Yeah. Just a great man. And we cannot say enough. We got to know him personally, but in any event, he gave us a wealth of information on the Lenny Bruce book. And then when we finished that, he said, if you ever want to do another book, I've got everything on the Howell Trial. And so we had written a little bit about the Howell Trial in Mania, a book that we did, which is really the backstory of the Howell Trial. But Lawrence Ferlinghetti on March 24th turned 100. So several months ago, we decided that it would be a good idea to pay a tribute to him as not simply as a poet, because our concern was that here was a publisher and a bookseller, all right, who took a very courageous stand. And we thought that we, having no background in literature or poetry, our contribution could be to highlight his importance in First Amendment history.
It's amazing he's still alive. 100.
He is. Larry, and if you're in this is a shout out to you.
He just published another book too, right?
He did.
It was his final words.
Well, I won't say final until,
Didn't that I was publisher pitched it though?
It was called Little Boy. And it's a novel, autobiographical novel that came out this year. And by the way, we were in City Lights Bookstore on March 24th for the celebration, and it was so wonderful. Hundreds and hundreds of poets and others had came out. People were reading poetry in the streets. It was terribly exciting to be at City Lights on March 24th to celebrate Lawrence Ferlinghetti's 100th birthday.
Yeah, the publisher of Little Boy describes it as a story steeped in the rhythmic energy of the beats, gleaming with Whitman's visionary spirit, channeling the incantory power of Proust and Joyce. And as the publisher says, this is Lawrence Ferlinghetti's last word. I don't know if that means it's the last word he'll ever provide, or if it's the last word on his life.
We'll see. But it wasn't the last word about the Howl poem and the First Amendment.
Yes.
Because, go ahead.
In 2007,
right.
As you describe in the book, there was a Howl for Liberty.
Right. This is the 50th anniversary of Howl. And David Skover and I had been thinking about this, and we thought that we got a posthumous pardon for Lenny Bruce, thanks to Bob Cornrevere and others. Bob Cornrevere, the lawyer on the posthumous pardon case. But we thought, Howl in 2007 was illegal during daylight hours. That's 8 to 10 or 11. Never sure which, but it was illegal to read Howl on broadcast radio or television. The indecency doctrine had was well in force. There was FCC versus Pacifica, the 7 Dirty Words case.
George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words.
Yeah, George Carlin. So since Howl had some colorful words in it, though it had been aired on radio in the 50s and early 60s, but by 2007 it was illegal, and you could be punished with heavy fines. I had, along with David Skover, we had reached out to Bob Cornrevere and some others to say, look, let's test this. Let's test this. So along with Lawrence Ferlinghetti and others, we went to Pacifica Radio in San Francisco. And we wanted to see if they would be willing to play Howl. The 1959 recording, if they would be willing to do that. And, it was Janet Coleman over at WBAI radio. And Janet is a very feisty First Amendment persona, and I think she was ready to go to the mat. And Pacifica Radio had always been supportive of Ferlinghetti, supportive of free speech. And we said, look, we've got the attorneys. They're going to come in and, they'll even do it pro bono for you. Let's test this. Well, they got thinking about it. They're lawyers. As my father used to say, if you want to ruin a deal, bring in the lawyers. Mm-hmm. But listen, it's one thing for us to say, we want you to do this and we've got your back. But in case you lose, you will pay a very steep fine, and this could be the end of your radio.
You could have found funders that would be willing to.
The fine would have been very substantial,
okay.
And hundreds of thousands of dollars per word.
Oh, geez.
And so
and for a poem like this, that'd be a lot of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, and then they could lose their license.
Not worth it.
And so they decided. I think left to herself, Janet would have done it, but the lawyers had counseled and said otherwise. So Janet came up with this idea that we'd have this tribute to Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Ferlinghetti would be interviewed, and the poem would be aired, the 1959 version that Allen Ginsberg had recorded, but it would be done on internet radio. And and a transcript of that interview with Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Janet Coleman is appended to our book. And so there's still a fight to be fought. It's still contraband on broadcast and broadcast radio and television, although it can be read on cable television. And it can be read, obviously, on
some of these
internet.
FCC rules are just so ridiculous in today's day and age. With the internet and cable television, it just they don't make any sense anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you could watch porn on your television, and when you're clicking, does anybody know? They say, "Oh, honey, darling, sweetheart," whatever your phrase is for your significant other. We're going to cable now. Tell the children to leave the room. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. But a fight remains to be fought.
Well, there was a fight for the rest of Allen Ginsberg's life. I mean, he was a free speech champion for the rest of it. He's also happened to be good friends with Fire's co-founder, Harvey Silverglate, and his wife, Elsa Dorfman. Errol Morris just made a documentary called The B-Side about Elsa Dorfman's photography, in which Allen Ginsberg is featured very prominently. That sort of circle understood free speech, and they understood the stakes because they took the risks.
Well, on this particular one, Allen didn't. He left that to I suspect if he was in San Francisco, if truth be known, he would have been happy to step up. But you
take risks insofar as if you lose, no one's going to be willing to publish a work like that again.
Well, the thing is, in fairness to Allen, to bare his soul the way he did in this poem was really remarkable. And it is really just a vibrant and courageous statement of, I'm gay and I'm proud and I'm going to speak up and I will howl from, the top of my lungs and from the rooftops. In 1956, I'm sorry, people just didn't do that then. And so it took, on the one hand, a howler like Allen Ginsberg, and it took a cool, calm bookstore owner, book publisher like Ferlinghetti with a lot of backbone, and you put them together and you have, the story of Howl and its publication and its vindication and the judge who made it all possible.
Yeah, unfortunately, Allen Ginsberg is no longer with us. Lawrence Ferlinghetti is the only one really left standing.
Right.
Because they died in old age. Allen Ginsberg had liver cancer.
Yeah. There's an incredible photo of Ginsberg and Bob Dylan sitting in front of Jack Kerouac's tombstone. Ginsberg would have quite of an influence on Bob Dylan, and so I think one of the takeaways of this, apart from all the legalese, which is obviously the law is extremely important, and that is the importance of poetry and the importance of poets being able to express themselves in unconventional ways and to kind of speak to us in ways that others can't. And if you believe in that sort of thing, if you believe in poetry, which was, if you will, offensive in ancient Greece, Aristophanes, then you have to believe in the First Amendment. And poetry, like everything else in life, depends in some significant measure on freedom to speak one's mind as one sees it and as one feels it. And I would just leave you with this, if I may. It's something I had mentioned earlier. I think it's too easy to get on the First Amendment bandwagon and get kind of wrapped up in being righteous about it. I mean, listen, I'm happy to stand behind it in ways that offend people. But if you believe in the First Amendment, you have to believe that you're taking a risk. I mean, I think Justice Holmes in his Gitlow opinion said lifelike law is an experiment. Sometimes experiments fail, all right? But we've decided, for better or worse, I think for better, to take the chance, we as a people, and to err on the side of freedom. Does this mean that something will not necessarily turn out right? Does this mean that when you allow racists to speak and bigots to speak, that bigotry will not somehow have a new day in the marketplace? It may, but we think that the better answer is to counter it with counterspeech. And so in 1956 and 1957, Lawrence Ferlinghetti took a chance, and I think we're the better for it.
Yeah, that's a theme of so much of your work. With Lenny Bruce, I mean, he took a chance every time he went on stage and continued to perform his act despite knowing that there were police in the audience or police ready to bust him. On a previous podcast, we were talking with you about the case in re Anastopolo, about a man who refused to compromise his beliefs.
And in re Anastopolo ends up with that incredible line by Hugo Black, "We must not be afraid to be free." And it, that is the sort of thing that should be in every civics book. If civics is still taught in high school anymore, I don't know. But, I think it well represents the fighting spirit, not only of George Anastopolo, but people like Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg.
Well, Ron, I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, and thank you to you and, of course, David Skover for writing this fantastic book. It can be found wherever fine books are sold. It's a slim volume. The main text is around 100 pages. There's plenty of addenda, though, for you to explore after you're done reading it. I read it in an evening, so please do check it out. And Ron, thank you again for coming on the show.
It's been a delight to be here. Thank you.
This podcast is hosted, produced, and recorded by me, Nico Perrino, and edited by Aaron Reese. To learn more about So to Speak, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk, or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/so-to-speak-podcast. We also take feedback at so-to-speak@thefire.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please, as always, consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play or wherever else you get your podcasts. Reviews are one of the best ways for us to attract new listeners to the show. And until next time, thank you as always for listening.